Hi, everyone. Today we'll continue to look at the subtopic of gender in reference to social psychology. In doing so, we will be going through an article that did some interesting research and looked at how the idea of voice is actually a gendered idea. In certain situations, it can work for you. In other situations, it can work against you based upon how people are kind of gendering what's being said, what's being heard. So, some interesting research we'll get into. But just to briefly kind of recap what we've been doing so far, we started by looking at how gender social psychology is basically a product of learning and internalizing gender culture. So, a lot of our culture is gendered. And then when we're exposed and re-exposed to that culture, we internalize it and make it part of our social psychological makeup. And, we kind of applied this gender social psychology to the dinner and drinks activity. So basically, how we have different gender beliefs and how those gender beliefs sometimes consciously, unconsciously can influence, what people do, what they don't do. And it's not black and white, sometimes there's a lot of grayness going on. And that's why I wanted you to really think about and unpack in that dinners and drinks activity that you did. So we'll kind of continue that same line of thinking in the McLean article. So here, basically, we're looking at gender beliefs about other people. So again, we don't see other people simply people, but we see them more in terms of, their age, their race, and here, their sex. So, our beliefs about people that kind of come from this gendered cultural socialization. And when we, again, consciously, unconsciously start to start to use these gender beliefs, sometimes, that false inequality can emerge rather than inequality based upon merit or anything real. So again, kind of looking at this idea of a gendered voice. So you like to think that, when something is said, in a classroom, in a meeting at work, when something is said, when something is voiced, that, it should be taken at kind of face value. If it's good, what came out of your mouth, if it's good what you said, you should get full credit for it. No matter, if you're a woman or a man. And likewise, if what comes out of your mouth, what you say is not good, it's stupid, and then you should, be kind of seen as stupid too, no matter if you're male or female. So here we start to get into our idea, does it matter in terms of who's saying what they're saying? And basically, do we carry different gender beliefs about people? And do these gender beliefs influence kind of how we interpret what they're saying? And perhaps we give them more or less credit based upon not what they're saying per se, but who's actually saying it. So, this one example would be, if somebody says exact same thing as another person, then you would imagine that we should give them kind of the equal amount of credit for what they said. But we're trying to see here, um, does a variable of one's sex come into play as well? So you're saying the exact same thing, but do we give women more credit than we give men, or do we give men more credit than we give women for saying the same thing? So that's kind of one variable we're looking at. And the other variable is what we call voice type. And voice type basically is kind of, with what you're saying, are you trying to move the group forward and kind of promote to progress? Um, that's to promote a voice type. But the prohibitive voice type is when you kind of slow things down a little bit. Like, hey guys, we need to slow down and really think about this. Or maybe you want to go backward a little bit to kind of rethink about what you already did. And those are two different types of voice. And so basically, the study looks at how people are perceiving speakers, and does it matter in terms of if they're trying to move the group forward or kind of slow them down a little bit, and does it matter if they're a male or if they're a female? So those are the two main variables we're looking at: the sex of the speaker and what type of voice they're actually using. And then they see how these two variables come together to create benefits for the speaker. So the benefits basically would be increased social status. So if people kind of like what you're saying, they're going to elevate your social status in the group. And that increased social status then helps you emerge as a group leader. And so here is, the benefits in terms of, when you become a higher status member of the group, you're promoted to kind of a leadership position. And those leadership positions is where you start to have the power to kind of dictate things. And those leadership positions is when you start to get paid more money and kind of earn more status as well. So, those are kind of the items they're looking at here. And so we kind of retracing our steps before we look at the different hypotheses. And basically, this study is looking at the speaker. If the speaker is a male or female, does that matter in terms of do we give them status or not? And does it matter the voice type, the promotive, trying to move the group forward, or the prohibitive, kind of slowing things down? Do those variables matter when it comes to giving somebody higher status in the group and making them a group leader? So here, we have different hypotheses, and basically we're kind of work our way through them one by one. So again, gender voice, does it influence performance outcomes? Or we would say if they don't, then simply ideas and what's being said, we consider those things to be gender neutral if they don't influence. But if we do see a pattern that some people are given more credit, more status than other people, then you would say that these things are gendered rather than being gender neutral. So we can look at hypothesis 1A and 1B. And here we're looking at the voice type. So basically, does the promotive, does the prohibitive voice type positively correlate, relate to status? So if you use this type of voice, are you going to get higher status from your group members? And they find that with one type of voice, you do get status, but with the other type of voice, you do not. So the promotive voice, moving the group forward, trying to create progress, that's when people kind of see you as a good leader. That's when they see you as somebody who deserves higher status. So you get elevated. But on the other hand, those people who are trying to speak about caution and maybe slow things down a little bit, they don't get higher status. And you can imagine probably because they're seen as kind of slowing things down rather than moving forward to the end goal. So that's kind of the first finding. Voice type does matter. People give you higher status when you try to move the group forward, but people don't give you higher status when you try to slow things down a little bit. And then we'll move into hypothesis number 2. So here, after you get status from your fellow group members, does it help you emerge as a leader? And so basically, we find yes, in terms of when you're using that promotive voice that people give you higher status for, that ultimately helps you emerge later on as a group leader. And then on the other hand, with hypothesis 3, the prohibitive voice does not have that connection. And that makes sense because if you don't give people status for, using the prohibitive voice, then using the prohibitive voice is not going to relate to you becoming a group leader. And so now we get into the hypotheses 4 and 5. And here we get to the variable of sex. So kind of going back to our chart, we first looked at voice type as a variable, and we find that the benefits of getting increased status and emerging as group leader only relates to the promotive voice type. Now we're moving over to the variable sex to see if that matters at all when it comes to getting the benefits. And so for hypothesis 4, you start to look at the people who use promotive voice. Does one sex matter? And then you look at hypothesis 5, and there are people using the prohibitive voice. So let's just start with 5, because we already know from the earlier hypotheses that people who use that prohibitive voice are not given higher status. And when you're not given higher status, then you're not going to become a future group leader. So we can just get that out of the way. It says, of course, it doesn't matter if it's a guy or a girl using a prohibitive voice, because prohibitive voice itself doesn't lead to higher status. So that makes sense in the sense that that hypothesis was not supported. But now we can get into hypothesis four. And here we start to say that, one sex does matter. So they start to find that it's only the men who are kind of giving the higher status when they're using that promoter voice. So, in other words, when people are speaking about moving forward and kind of getting closer to the end of the goal, they're not getting the same amount of credit. Rather, when men are doing that, they're elevated with higher status. They're likely to become group leaders. But when women are using the same type of promoter voice, they're not given the same type of credit. So, unlike the men, they're not getting the higher status. And unlike the men, they're not going to emerge as group leaders later on. Although they're doing the same activity using the same type of voice, they're not given the same credit. They don't get the same returns in the sense of they don't get those benefits of higher status and becoming a group leader. So, going back to kind of the idea is, our ideas gendered in the sense that it doesn't matter where the idea is coming from. And here we say, yes, we do find that through the research. We find that, when using the promoter voice, men get credit for it and they get those benefits. And using the same type of promoter voice, the women are not receiving the same returns, are not receiving the same benefits. So again, I think this kind of nicely kind of ties into the dinner and drinks activity where, you like to think that nothing's going on gender wise, but if you sometimes really dig deep into it and you start to look at certain research like this, unconsciously or consciously, often one sex does come into play in terms of how we hear them and the credit we give them for what they're actually saying. So we'll leave that there for today, and then we'll continue to unpack, the social psychological dimension of our class, but then we'll move towards a new subtopic for our next class. We'll get back into the idea of leisure and kind of social psychological dimensions behind that. So we'll leave that there, and I'll see you next time.